This presentation has some content notes. I will be talking about theoretical discussions of fires, natural and human-made disasters, sudden health problems or injuries, and responding to thoughts of suicide. If any of this bothers you, I completely understand. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I won't be going into any of this until slide 8, so you have a little bit of time to step out of the room if that's what you need to do. What would you do if you, hypothetically, woke up, checked Slack while you were still in bed? I'm sure you would never do this, and saw this. For anyone who may not be able to read this, I will read it for you. This is our AWS TAM in our Slack. Can you please look into this case number blah. Your AWS account number blah is compromised. And since you don't have your AWS account IDs memorized, and if you do, please don't tell me, your mostly asleep brain assumes this is the big account. What would your brain do? This is what my brain did. Gonna need some coffee. But seriously, do you know what you would do if this happened in your company? If this was what you woke up to one morning, who would you call? Do you know? Would you have to look it up? Would there be anyone available to help you with this? My name is Courtney Eckhardt. I am from Heroku. I am here to talk to you about how to have an operational incident really fast. This is going to be very high level because I've got 30 minutes. You may know Heroku as one of the fastest ways to go from code to a running application. At Heroku, I am an SRE and an incident response specialist. And Heroku is a subsidiary of Salesforce, for anyone who missed the memo on that one. A lot of, because the branding is different, right? A lot of people don't realize. Fundamentally, I'm here to talk about emergencies. The most common definition of emergency that I could find is a situation that poses an immediate risk to health, life, property, or environment. Depending on your business, any one of these things could apply to you, but property or like business reputation is probably the most common thing that any of you will deal with in terms of an emergency in your jobs. You may have heard people, productivity coaches, talk about the difference between urgent and important. Urgent is about timeline. If something's urgent, it must be handled quickly or it's no longer relevant. An example of something that might be urgent is your coworkers are ordering lunch together. Do you want to order lunch with them? If you don't answer in 10 minutes, they time out and order lunch without you. Important is about needs or consequences. Making sure that you have your medication refilled on time, that you know where your children or your pets are and that they're safe. Important can be about danger. Right? So we have two different things that we're thinking about here: consequences, needs, safety, versus immediacy. An emergency is both of these things. It's urgent, it's time sensitive, and it's important. It's about danger, consequences, real world impacts. A fire would be about both danger and consequences, but a broken bone from a bad fall would be about consequences, right? And not necessarily danger in the moment. So now we understand a little bit about emergencies, but how do we know what an emergency is? How do you decide that this is an emergency? How are you made aware of an emergency? It's like a tree. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, it's not an emergency. So an emergency, someone has to know about it. They have to assess the situation, the urgency, the timeline, the risk of danger or consequences. They have to decide, this situation is an emergency. Emergencies are observed and reported. In the physical world, maybe you see something that is about to happen. You encounter a person who is in distress. In our industry, you probably get paged. Hopefully you get paged by a monitoring device and your infrastructure directly, but maybe you get paged by your support staff or a teammate. When you're paged, when you're made aware of this emergency, you have to decide how to respond. In the physical world, you might call 911, or you might call your security company or alarm company, building security, depending on what it is. In our industry, probably you respond by paging more people, right? We don't handle these sorts of things solo, generally. How many times have you said, you heard someone say, It didn't have time to think. Thinking takes time. If you don't know what the options are, you'll freeze. So in order to respond to an emergency, which we have declared to be urgent, as quickly and effectively as possible, you need to eliminate the need for people to think in their response. As many people as possible, you need to just remove any need that they have to think about the situation. They need to already know what the next step would be. That's why calling 911 connects you to a dispatcher who can reach all of the common response teams directly, so you don't have to take a moment to decide, do I need the fire department? Do I need an ambulance? Do I need both? This is on the back of my hotel room door. It's probably on the back of any hotel room door in this city. Similar things are on the back of hotel room doors anywhere in North America. 911 creates a framework for response. It represents years of planning and communicating that plan. What do you do when there's an emergency? You call 911. Or whatever it is in your country, right? But here, 911. When you do that, the dispatcher knows who they can call, how to reach the people that they can call, how to get information from you about the situation that you're reporting, and they know to remind you to keep yourself safe. That's critical. As the person who discovers an emergency, one of your responsibilities is to make sure you put on your own oxygen mask or whatever the appropriate response is, so that the emergency responders, when they arrive, don't have to take care of you as well. This framework, this 911 framework, this communicated plan is what enables you to respond when you encounter a physical world emergency. Because if you don't know what the options for help are, you don't know what to do. Calling 911 also triggers the response framework used by the dispatcher and the emergency response specialists that person calls. Fire personnel, EMT, and police have plans for how to reach the emergency, that's called assembling, how to stay in contact with the dispatcher while they reach the site of the emergency, how to assess the emergency when they arrive, how to communicate within their group and across groups. For instance, at a fire, you have at minimum fire personnel and EMTs who need to communicate with each other and then across that boundary. And they know how to escalate, summon more fire trucks, summon more ambulances. The details of these plans vary by country, but most countries have something that's publicly documented. You can go read about it on a national website or Wikipedia. Canada's is called an Emergency Management Framework for Canada. The US uses the National Incident Management System. Heroku is a US company. Our internal incident response is based on the US standard, the National Incident Management System. So what have we learned? Frameworks allow people to respond quickly and effectively. There's a lot of text here, by the way. You don't have to read all of this. We're going to go through each of these things point by point. Frameworks are about organization and planning. If you discover something that might be an emergency and your mind goes blank, that means that you have not been enabled to respond in this situation. You don't know what you need to do in order to react appropriately. There isn't a plan that you already know about. One thing that many of us may have encountered, this trips up a lot of people the first few times that it happens to them. If a friend confesses to you that they don't know if they can go on, they're feeling suicidal, it's hard to know how to respond to that. You need training. The first response that most people have is to go blank or say, I don't want you to leave. I would miss you. Those are not terrible responses, but there are better ones if you're trained. A professional situation where a lot of us are not enabled to respond is a security incident. Do you know what you would do if you were the first one to become aware of a data breach at your company? If you were the first one to become aware of malware on a critical server? Do you know how you would escalate that? A lot of people don't. And that's not about you. Again, that's about the communication, the framework, the planning. So I spent a lot of time talking about physical world emergency response. Let's try to apply this. The best way to do this in your company is to take a national system and adapt it to your needs and tools, and the rest of my talk is going to be discussing how to do that, how to make sure that you have at least the basics covered. So first you have to define what is an emergency, and you have to know that you will know when there is an emergency. You need to be sure that you have some kind of monitoring and alerting, or at minimum that your customers can tell your support people who can page you, right? You need a way to know that something is going wrong. Then you need to decide what constitutes an emergency for you and your company. In a commercial context, this usually means that people either can't use what they're paying you for, or they can't pay you in order to start using it. Examples of this: not being able to buy things on Amazon, that's an emergency for Amazon. Not being able to launch a new app on Heroku, that's an emergency for us. Then you need to know how to get help. Like 911, if you make people decide who to engage or how to engage them, you will waste precious time every time you have an emergency. It needs to be really clear and communicated over and over and over again. You need a single point of contact. Want something that's easy to use, something that's easy to remember, and you need to make sure that everyone hears about it until they're sick of it. The same way that you're sick of the notices on the back of the hotel room door and you probably never read them anymore. We use a / command in Slack, like a customized one. We have a Slack bot, and we can page the incident commander. It's literally /PD page IC. The people that are reached by your 911 call in your company need to be able to respond. They need to know who else they can contact. They need to know how to reach those people. Probably the people that you will reach in your company when you trigger this emergency signal will be the same people who will act as what's called an incident commander, who's the person who manages and coordinates the entire response to an emergency. Unlike the 911 dispatcher, these people will probably continue to work with everyone who is handling the emergency until it is over. That may not be the case depending on the size of your company. You may decide that you want the abstraction layer of a dispatcher versus an incident commander. Most places I've worked have not used that. So after that, you need to decide how people are going to assemble and how they are going to communicate when they have assembled. In physical space, you go to a place. It's often somewhat ambiguous, right? The site of a large disaster does not have a street address, and so some decisions have to be made about what it means to assemble, how you know that everyone's got there, how you coordinate when you get there. But most of us are not going to be going to a data center, right, to respond to an emergency. We're not going to be showing up in person. So we need to know how we are showing up. Is it a conference call? Is it Slack? Is it, I don't know, Basecamp, something else? Whatever you're using internally, that needs to be defined. It needs to not be a surprise to anyone. And you need to have a backup plan for if it's not available. What do you do if you use Slack for your incident response like we do, and Slack has an outage because AWS has an outage, and so we're all having an outage? In our case, we use Hangouts in that situation, but that's something that you need to think about. You also need to make sure that your point of assembly, whatever it is not based on your own infrastructure, right? If your infrastructure goes down, you still have to be able to show up someplace and respond to that failure. You need to decide what it means in your context to assess the emergency. In our industry, you're probably looking for impacted systems, changes to customer experience. If you identify the impacted systems, that means that you can get the right people to join your incident response. If you can identify the customer experience problems, that means you can tell customers what you're aware of and what you're working on so that they know you're on it and they don't badger you, but they also know if they're seeing something that is not what you have said that you're working on. This is an ongoing task for the incident commander during the course of the incident. The situation, the impacts, what everyone is seeing, what everyone is doing changes constantly, especially if you have an incident based on a third-party vendor like Amazon. I'm picking on Amazon a lot. We are entirely based on Amazon. I used to work at Amazon, so that's why. The situation may change based on what you do or based on what they're doing. And so this is a constant flow that the incident commander needs to be in, and you need to have a protocol for how to decide what assessing the situation looks like for you. The essence of successful incident response is cooperation and delegation. We can't do this solo. We have to divide up the work. In dividing up the work, we still need to have clear lines of communication between all of the people who are working on the incident so that nothing gets lost, so that you don't duplicate effort, so that you can parallelize trying different solutions to the situation that you have in front of you. It also means that all people handling this work need to report back to the incident commander on a regular basis in order to feed the incident commander's assessment of the situation. You can't go off and do the thing that you were assigned to do, but then not come back with the response. During an incident, the start of authority for your company is the incident commander. The incident commander is the one who says what we do and what we don't do. The reason for that is, if you have two people giving directions, everyone who's listening has to pick a side. That's even slower than deciding who to call, right? You need to have one person who's giving directions, and they might not be the right directions in all cases, right? None of us are perfect. We're all doing the best that we can. But it is worse to have conflict over what's happening next. The incident commander is the only one who is completely cognizant, as much as anyone in an emergency ever is, of what's going on. Even if you're all talking in the same Slack channel, the incident commander's only focus is what's happening, what have we tried, what are we trying next. Everyone else involved in the incident has someone else that they need to be responsible for, something else that they need to pay attention to. The incident commander is the one who's paying attention to the progress of the entire incident. And then you need to decide how you know it's over, how people leave. You need some criteria for done. What does done look like in this case? Sometimes that's really clear. There's no more customer impact. We rolled back the bad change, whatever. But what if the answer is, we mitigated this, but we're not going to have the fix from the vendor for 3 weeks? What if the answer is, we can't mitigate it, and we're not going to have the fix from the vendor for 3 weeks? What if it's a security incident, and now the company has to patch every Redis it owns, and it's going to take 3 weeks? You need to start coming up with some high-level plans for what to do when the end of the incident is ambiguous. And then you have a special case of assembly and dispersal, which is shifts. Operational incidents can be very fast, but they can also last hours or days. Security incidents sometimes last weeks or months, depending on how much stuff you have to patch. You need an idea of what a shift is like for you and what the process for a shift change should look like. I strongly recommend 4 hours. It's what we discovered empirically, like at the end of 4 hours, no matter how much food and coffee and support someone has, their brain is just tired and they need a break. And actually, Salesforce employs some folks who teach incident response to DevOps people as a career. They are former emergency responders themselves. They also said 4 hours, so that is something that seems to be universal across emergency response. Those of you who like to take pictures of slides, get your phones out. This is the summary. This is your minimum viable incident response plan. There's a lot more to it than this. This is all I've got time for today. If you cover this stuff, you're on your way. You have something to get started from. You have something you can move forward with. You can start to see the things that you aren't handling yet once you've got this down. And then you need training. At the very barest minimum, you have to train your incident commanders, and you have to document what you expect of them. You have to document criteria for an emergency, criteria for customer communication, criteria for releasing everyone in the incident. But you'll get much better results if you give that same training to every engineer that you have, regardless of whether they will serve as incident commander. Everyone that we at Heroku have given this training to, even if they did not themselves serve as an incident commander, said that it made them feel much more confident in an incident, it made them understand what was expected of them, it helped them to know what the incident commander was going to ask them, and more importantly, why. It reduced grumpiness because none of the questions seemed ludicrous anymore. They all seemed sensible. Next steps, after you've got that MVP, there's a lot of things you can look at next. Many, many places. This is really just like scratching the surface. You might need to know sometimes how to get the lawyers involved. You might need to know how to get PR people involved. You might need to know how to get your vendors involved. You might need to know how your vendors get you involved. There's any number of times where AWS has had to find us and tell us to cut it out. You're hurting stuff, cut it out. So for those of you who have been wondering about my story since the beginning, the account in question was a brand new dev account, which immediately had its credentials checked into GitHub by accident. So there was nothing in the account. There was no real compromise. Immediately, all the credentials were rolled. There was no particular impact. But several other people also saw that message and came to me over the course of the day and said, is the main account compromised? What are we doing? So there was still a little bit of communication and incident response in that moment, even though there was no actual emergency. Further resources, again, if you like to take pictures of slides, these are other things you can read to get started. These are things that I have not yet read that I want to read. I have a couple of acknowledgments. One of my friends graciously read over this presentation, helped me find rough areas, let me know where I was being inaccurate. Also, I recently became a mental health first aid responder, which is like if you go take CPR lessons, right? So you see someone who needs, chest compressions, right? That's the physical response. The mental health first aid is you see someone who's having a crisis, and how do you respond to them? And taking that training, especially with all of the incident response that I do in my job, really highlighted for me the difference between being enabled to respond to a situation and not being enabled to respond. And also, I just love talking about that training, so if you have any questions, come and find me. Thank you so much for listening.